Dozens of Russian conscripts lie dead in the front yards of Russian homes. This is the reality in Russia's Kursk region right now, as Ukraine continues to push its offensive, bringing the war to Russian parents' doorsteps. In early August, Ukraine shocked the world with a sudden invasion into Russia's Kursk Oblast. In what military strategists term the Uno reverse card, Ukraine invaded Russia, and Russia was not prepared in the least. Within days, Ukrainian forces had liberated hundreds of square kilometers of Russia from itself, prompting the evacuation of nearly 100,000 residents. Russia's attempts to respond to this invasion have been nothing short of disastrous, prompting fears of an even deeper Ukrainian invasion. The invasion has been a stunning military success. What's perhaps most impressive, though, is the fact that Ukraine was able to keep the invasion completely secret, even from its closest allies, including the United States. But more importantly, Russia had no clue it was coming, which is hard to believe given how transparent the Ukrainian battlefield has been until now. The proliferation of drones and other ISR technologies makes surprise a thing of the past, and yet all the evidence firmly points at Russia having been caught with its pants down in the Kursk Oblast. That in itself is a stunning display of incompetence on behalf of the Russian armed forces. The Kursk offensive, initially labeled an incursion or a raid, has proven to be much more. This is a full-blown invasion, and Ukraine seems to have no intention of retreating back across the border. Unlike previous incursions by anti-Putin Russian militias, this incursion is being carried out by regular Ukrainian forces, bringing a significant amount of top-tier firepower with them. That's what makes it so incredible that Russia was completely caught off guard. When anti-Putin militias launched several incursions into Russian territory throughout 2023 and 2024, they were difficult to detect ahead of time. Most of these raids were carried out on foot, meaning to sow some fear into the local population and put some political pressure on Putin by embarrassing him. A few of them brought along a handful of armored vehicles, but not enough to pose a serious challenge to Russian defenders. Inevitably, these incursions quickly retreated back across the safety of the Ukrainian border. But it was their low numbers and sparing use of large pieces of combat gear that made them difficult to anticipate. Not so in the Kursk invasion. Operational secrecy is still incredibly strict, but it's been confirmed that Ukrainian forces have invaded Russia with everything from Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, Humvees, artillery, and even helicopters. An estimated few hundred troops supported by a reserve force of 2,000 spearheaded the invasion. The concentration of so much combat power in one area should have set off the alarm bells in the Kremlin long before the invasion occurred. That is, if anyone had been paying attention to the border. Because, spoiler alert, the Russians weren't. Russia has used the West's fear of escalation against it to stunning success. Despite being fully committed in Ukraine, the world's most powerful military alliance, the single most powerful assembly of combat power in all of human history combined, has historically been terrified of the possibility of a conflict escalation against a Russia who can't even beat a nation with a fraction of its population and GDP. Trembling at the thought of the NATO military alliance facing off against the few conscripts Russia could spare outside of Ukraine, Western leaders have significantly curtailed both the types and scope of military aid provided to Ukraine. Instead of delivering war-winning levels of equipment, the West has cautiously tested the waters by sending token shipments of aid, gradually increasing them when no European capital was consumed in Russian nuclear fire. The fear of escalation has translated into how Ukraine is allowed to fight the war. Western weapons were under no circumstances allowed to be used outside of internationally recognized Ukrainian borders, and even Crimea was off limits for a while there at the start of the war. The West also put pressure on Ukraine over how it could use its own weapons to fight Russia. Long-range missiles or airstrikes into Russian territory was completely out of the question. Only drones seemed to get a pass from the Western alliance, and when they started to score critical damage to Russian energy infrastructure, the US and others began to complain about their use as well. The problem for Ukraine is that these restrictions effectively neutered its ability to defend itself against the Russian invasion. The irony is that the US should know better. This is not how wars are won. In fact, it's how one loses a war. It was always winning, because that's exactly what happened to America. Back in Vietnam, the United States military won every engagement it entered, and yet it still lost the war. Prohibited from putting boots on the ground in North Vietnam, the US attempted to bomb the North into submission instead. It eventually reached the point where there were no strategic targets left to bomb in North Vietnam. They had all been destroyed. Yet, without capturing territory, the NVA was free to maneuver, consolidate its forces, and sort out its logistics. Life may have been uncomfortable for them, but the North Vietnamese army was far from ready to call it quits. They were free instead to continue to run supplies down into the south and use their own territory to launch raids against American and South Vietnamese forces, wearing both down until the war became so unpopular the US had no choice but to leave. The US is making the same mistake in Russia, except with far more deadly consequences for the Ukrainians. Free from harassment other than the occasional drone, Russian bases just across the border have operated with impunity, serving as staging areas for supplies, combat troops, and strike aircraft. Russia has been able to funnel an uninterrupted stream of combat power into Ukraine, while Ukraine was not allowed to do anything about it. These restrictions began to ease in early 2024 as Russia massed forces for an assault against Kharkiv. The prognosis was grim. Russia was massing a significant assault force just outside of the Ukrainian borders, and initial raids had met with little resistance. The loss of Kharkiv would be a massive blow to Ukrainian morale, especially since it was recaptured during the stunning success of the 2022 fall counterattack. Analysts in the West and even some Ukrainian leaders predicted a bloody but catastrophic battle, with victory for Russian forces. Then the US made a surprise announcement that changed the course of the battle and possibly the entire war. Up until May 2023, Russia had operated only a token security force along its border with Ukraine. Instead of troops, Russia relied on Western fears to secure its border, knowing that Ukraine wouldn't dare launch an invasion of its territory because its Western partners would never allow such an escalatory move. Vladimir Putin's constant threats of using tactical nuclear weapons had convinced many that the first Ukrainian soldier to cross the border would be met with a nuke. And if Western weapons were used, then Russian nukes would soon block out the sky over the European capitals. Russia was safe because of Western fear, and this has freed up a massive amount of combat power that it could instead funnel into the front lines inside of Ukraine. It's also operated with impunity just across its own border, using airfields and bases miles from the border to strike at Ukrainian forces and civilians. In Kharkiv, Russia had massed thousands of troops and their equipment well within the range of Ukrainian artillery, confident that they were protected by the West's restrictions. Then, President Biden changed all that overnight. In a stunning announcement, and the first truly escalatory step of the entire war, President Biden gave the green light for American arms to be used in specific areas of the Ukraine-Russian border, within specific ranges. This prevented Ukraine from lobbing ATACMS at the Kremlin, but it did open up thousands of unprotected troops and their vehicles to Ukrainian artillery. And so the guns opened up on them, delivering a brutal and crushing blow to Russian forces that broke the back of the entire assault. Within 24 hours, Ukraine had launched over 130 HIMARS strikes, backed up by a blitzkrieg of conventional artillery and drones. The invisible shield that protected Russian troops in their own territory had fallen, but Russia still believed itself safe across its own borders. The attack into Kursk exploited Russia's complacency to devastating effect, and it was itself expertly planned and executed, prompting some to question if there was really no Western involvement in the preparation at all. The Ukrainians opened up with artillery strikes against the few known Russian positions, mostly border guards and conscripts with no combat experience. Then a force of elite Kraken special forces and battle-hardened troops poured across the border in combat vehicles. Above their heads, Ukrainian aviation delivered strikes against Russian positions and helped ferry troops and supplies into the seized territory. A massive electronic warfare campaign shut down Russian communications, sowing even more confusion into the mix and preventing them from coordinating a response with what few forces were available. Ukraine then complicated a Russian response even further with the use of artillery-dispensed anti-vehicle mines and traditional mining techniques. The invasion area in South Kursk only has a few roadways through which a Russian military response could come, and these were quickly mined in anticipation of Russian reinforcements. Russia, however, quickly put together a large convoy, mostly made up of Rosguard, or the National Guard, former Wagner, and some special forces swiftly deployed to the area. The convoy was filmed by many Russians fleeing the invasion, but before it could even enter the battle, it was ambushed by long-range Ukrainian artillery, likely HIMARS. A similar convoy, this time bringing 2 T-62 tanks, was destroyed on the road, and 2 separate convoys full of conscripts were ambushed by Ukrainian forces, with one confirmed to have fallen victim to HIMARS. The second convoy, likely full of conscripts, was destroyed along the 38K017 highway. with 14 Ural and Kamaz trucks destroyed along with many of their occupants. Dozens of Russians have been captured so far in the offensive, with a group of approximately 30 being filmed by drone as they surrendered to Ukrainian forces and were then taken into custody. Reports from the front have verified that most of these are Russian conscripts, many of them in their late teens or early 20s. The death of a potentially 100 or more conscripts to Ukrainian ambushes and the capture of dozens of others has prompted a social media campaign from Russian mothers hoping to bring awareness to the plight of their conscripted sons. As the campaign continues, inexperienced Russian forces continue to suffer more casualties to Ukraine's battle-tested assault forces. It's clear Ukraine has long-term plans for Kursk, as it's brought up an impressive mix of combat power, including air defense vehicles. Defensive fortifications began to be built after the first day of the offensive, and Ukraine looks set to establish itself permanently on Russian soil. The big questions then are why? And what can Russia do about it? There are numerous theories behind the Kursk offensive, and not much of actual policy to go off, given how tight-lipped Ukraine has been in the matter. The fact that the White House was ready with a response to the offensive, stating that it supported, quote, common-sense actions to stop attacks by Russian forces, strongly hints that the U.S. was not surprised by this development. The single greatest roadblock to a continued Russian invasion seems to be cleared with America on board, and the rest is up to Russia and its ability to resist the invasion. There's also speculation that Ukraine might be looking to target the Kursk nuclear power plant, which sits a few dozen kilometers from the border. This thought is that it might then trade the Kursk power plant for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which is under Russian control. However, this is extremely unlikely for multiple reasons. The first being that the plant is very deep inside Russian territory, and Ukrainian forces are unlikely to be able to support an offensive that deep into Russia. Even now, Russia is still making small incremental gains across part of the front, and the Kursk offensive has been criticized by some for taking up troops that could be used to reinforce the front lines. The second reason why Ukraine is unlikely to be looking to swap nuclear power plants is because the Zaporizhzhia power plant sits on the opposite side of the Dnipro River from Ukrainian-controlled territory. That means that even if a swap was made, Russian forces could simply retake the plant with ease. Any forces stationed on the Russian side of the river would be easy to overwhelm, their supply and reinforcements cut off by the river. Another theory on Ukraine's aim is that it's seeking to force Russia to divert forces from the front lines while putting political pressure on Putin himself. The idea that this is also meant to put political pressure on Putin also has some basis in truth. So far, 76,000 Russians have evacuated the Kursk region, sending shockwaves across Russian society. Vladimir Putin has authorized a payment of 10,000 rubles to those refugees, which amounts to roughly $100. Even more pressing, though, is the need to provide food, water, and shelter as refugee camps are being rapidly built. As of August 10th, though, only an estimated 1,000 beds have been provided for the refugees, and the timing of Ukraine's invasion may not have been a mistake. We are approximately 45 days from the start of bitterly cold weather in the region, when those refugees, and likely more to come, will be in critical need of warm shelter that the Russian forces seem to be scrambling to provide. Russia has weaponized refugees for years, deliberately targeting civilians in Syria and Libya to force them to flee into Europe. This has put some serious strain on the European society and has helped spur the rise of right-wing nationalist groups that have more in common with Putin's agenda than their own national priorities. The irony of refugees now being weaponized against Russia is not lost on anyone observing the invasion of Kursk. So, what options does Russia have, and why are they all bad? The first option, which Russia seems to be taking at the moment, is to refrain from pulling any units from the front lines. This will leave the counterattack against Ukrainian forces up to FSB border guards, Rosguardia troops, and other conscripts. Other irregular forces such as former Wagner soldiers and Chechen Akhmat units already in the affected areas, though Chechnya's famous TikTok warriors seem to have retreated in the face of Ukraine's assault. According to a senior Chechen commander, mighty Akhmat forces, once feared throughout Russia and now generally accepted as a laughingstock, failed to stop the Ukrainian advance because the Ukrainians went around them. There might actually be some truth to that, as when driving an offensive, you don't meet force with force, you instead circumvent and cut enemy units off to be more easily dispatched or forced to surrender. However, the extremely hasty retreat of Akhmat units strongly hints that TikTok's most fearsome warriors opted to run away rather than face combat against Ukrainian veterans. Per Russian mill bloggers, It appears that there may be some Russian airborne forces defending a small section of the front in Kursk since late May 2024, but reporting overall makes it clear that Russian forces in the region are made up of far less combat-capable units. Still, if Ukraine does not push much further or is simply overwhelmed by numbers or a supply constraint, the Kremlin may opt to keep combat units inside of Ukraine where they're needed most. The current border region seized by Ukraine doesn't hold a great strategic value after all. Russia's second option is to use the northern grouping forces to counter Ukraine's invasion. It's estimated that Russia's northern grouping force is composed of 35,000 personnel deployed across Kursk, Bryansk, and Belgorod oblasts as of early May 2024. The plan was to grow this force to as many as 75,000 personnel, but it was used in the ill-fated assault on Kharkiv Oblast in May, suffering heavy casualties and never reaching the planned strength. Claims by Russia's senior-most general, General Valery Gerasimov, is that the northern grouping force along with FSB components successfully stopped Ukraine's advances in Kursk, inflicting heavy casualties on the invading force. However, given that as of the writing of this script there are 3 different axes of advance being pursued by Ukrainian forces in Kursk, that claim is almost certainly a lie. The truth is that the northern grouping of forces is likely too expended by the disastrous attempt to invade Kharkiv earlier in the summer. Ukraine is unlikely to have attempted such a bold operation if this Russian force was truly combat capable. Still, enough remain that Russia may opt to use them in an attempt to stop Ukraine's attack, an option likely preferable over sending more conscripts to die in combat, which is already proving to be deeply unpopular with Russian citizens. Russia's final 2 options are equally as bad, and they don't bode well for its ongoing war inside Ukraine's borders. First, Russia may opt to deploy whatever operational reserves it still has remaining from its planned summer 2024 offensive into Kursk. It may also deploy committed combat units to the region. Both of these are bad choices, as it ensures that Russia's position inside of Ukraine will weaken, opening up opportunities for Ukraine to counterattack and recover lost ground. Now, at the moment, Russia is slowly advancing across much of the front, albeit in gains measured in meters and at great cost, with an estimated 1,000 or more casualties a day during some periods of fighting. The last option is for Russia to keep the forces it currently has in Kursk and instead support them with a massive redirection of aviation and long-range strike elements. Currently, Russia is successfully conducting strikes on the front and immediately behind the fronts against Ukrainian positions, heavily leveraging the use of glide bombs, which keep Russian jets safely out of range of air defenses. To stop the Kursk offensive, Russia may seek to redeploy these assets along with rotary aviation to the region without moving ground combat forces. This is a bad option for multiple reasons, the first being that Russia's frontline gains are largely possible thanks to its air superiority. Russian troops are poorly trained and poorly equipped, and the loss of combat aviation would force them to launch ground assaults against better trained and better equipped Ukrainian units that so far are being heavily disrupted by ongoing airstrikes. The loss of Russian aviation across the front comes with the terrifying proposition for Russians that Ukraine would now have an opportunity to mass Western tanks and IFVs for decisive assaults against positions defended by inferior Russian combat vehicles. But it's also unclear if even a large-scale redeployment of air power would have the desired results. Ukrainian positions are widely dispersed, and reports from the region indicate that Ukraine has brought along significant quantities of air defense equipment. A heavy air campaign here could come with equally heavy losses for Russian aviation. But even more to the point, the extremely low quality of troops currently available in the region makes it unclear if they're even capable of launching successful counterattacks against battle-hardened Ukrainian troops. To date, Russia has not shown the capability to launch the type of coordinated long-range strike combined with ground maneuver needed to dislodge such a large Ukrainian force, let alone do it with conscripts and inexperienced troops. Then there's the specter of Ukrainian F-16s, which are now confirmed to be in the country. Russian aviation operating in Kursk would at the moment be very easy prey for Ukrainian F-16s armed with Western long-range missiles. The use of Ukrainian rotary aviation in the region indicates that Russia has few air defenses here. What is clear is that Russia has been completely caught off guard by the Kursk invasion and has to date lacked a coherent response. What happens by the time you finally watch this video is anyone's guess, but it is clear that Ukraine aims to continue its invasion of Russia as part of its strategy to win the war on its terms. Now go check out how the CIA is helping Ukraine defeat Russia, or click this other video